I would be very surprised if you haven't heard of the fabric Godmother Carnation Blouse. I saw it earlier this year and immediately snapped it up. Not for myself, but for my best friend. She absolutely loves the Chlo Blouse by Sézane. She has 3 currently and is always on the lookout for new ones in colours and fabrics that she likes. When I sent her the Carnation Blouse pattern, she was on board for me giving it a try for one of the many Christmas birthday presents that I owe her. Now, I have to say that it's not completely my fault that she doesn't have all of these Christmas presents that I have offered to make for her, because she usually won't let me measure her for any of the dresses that she would like me to make. So trying to pin her down to actually make something for her has been very difficult until the Carnation Blouse was released. As I say, she has a lot of the Sézane Chlo blouses, which I believe was the inspiration for the Carnation Blouse. Tatty very kindly sent me one of her blouses to have a look at so that I could make her new Carnation Blouse as close to perfect as possible. So this is my friend's actual Chlo. It's a size 40 and she has a few of these and she absolutely loves this shape. So I wanted to have a look at this one before I make her very own version out of this Liberty Tana lawn that she found in her local charity shop. She's lent me this one so I can have a look at the details, because there are a few differences between this and the Carnation Blouse. The biggest difference I can see is that the Carnation Blouse has a different cuff treatment. This one has a continuous lap and lap over cuff, and the Carnation Blouse, as far as I can see, has a different kind of button detail, and one that I've not actually sewn before, so I'm not terribly sure how it goes together. I know Tatty loves this one, so I'm going to be altering the pattern to match with this one. This also has gathering into the cuff, whereas the Carnation Blouse has 2 tucks, and the cuff measurement on this is a lot shorter than the cuff on the actual pattern. So I'm going to be making a few tweaks to the cuff to replicate this. Also, the length of this blouse is not quite as long as Tatty would like. This one is 23 inches from shoulder to hem. I know Tatty would like another couple of inches on that, and they've added lengthen and shorten lines to the pattern, which is awesome. I love when companies do that, so I can very easily just add on the length. I'm also going to add length to the sleeves. She tends to wear them rolled up. She would like them a little bit longer so that she can wear them with the cuff buttoned if she wanted to. The other thing is this frill is actually 2 layers. The Carnation Blouse is 1 pattern piece that's sewn together on the fold. This one is 2 layers, but that's because it's got an extra trim added in there as well. Hopefully you can see that. There's extra trim along the edge. That's a really easy change to make, and you could easily tweak the pattern piece to give yourself room to put in trim like this if you wanted to, and a lot of the Chlo blouses do have trim added to the frill. I'm not 100% sure if the Carnation Blouse has a yoke that comes over the shoulder, but the Chlo Blouse does. There are small darts there. There is an interior yoke as well, so that means I'll be burritoing the yoke. There is a collar stand. Pretty much other than that, it's a regular shirt. So yeah, I thought it would be interesting to show you guys an original Chlo shirt, and then we can see how the Carnation Blouse turns out. So after having taken all of the different measurements and comparing the Chlo to the Carnation, there are a few tweaks and changes that I need to make. I have traced my printed pattern. I had it printed at Net Printers. It cost a small fortune, so I am going to trace it because I don't want to cut out the size 12, because there's a huge size range on this one and I want to preserve the larger sizes for later use. You never know what will happen and who you would be making a blouse for. I have traced my printed pattern, but that's just my preference. Now that this is all traced, I need to cut this out, and then I need to add the length into the front, back, placket and sleeve, and then I need to work on the cuff and drafting a continuous lap, working on the cuff to make the cuff the right size. Those are the next steps. I have here the collar frill left side, so this is the shorter one, and it's only the shorter one because it's easier to show you. You're going to need to do this to both the left and right hand side collar frill pieces. As you know, I've traced out my pattern because that's my preference. I also want to be able to use this pattern piece in the future as is, so I'm going to trace this again. The difference this time is that I am going to just trace 1/2 of it. So basically from this point to the other end, you want to draw a line straight down the middle. Conveniently, they've made that your grain line, so you can use the grain line, just extend it through the point and down to the other end, and you're going to trace over that pattern piece. You want to make sure that you're marking in all of your notches because that will make life much easier for you when you are inserting this collar piece. Obviously, if you cut something apart to add a style line, you need to add seam allowance. For this particular piece, I added because I wasn't going to be French seaming this. There was going to be bulk added from the trim and I was going to be trimming away this piece later, so I didn't need to add my usual 5/8 of an inch. You can make a smaller seam allowance if you prefer, whatever your preferred seam allowance is, but just make sure that you add that to the center. So this piece here, this is where the trim is going to get added in. This is the edge that gets folded over and sewn to this edge and then gathered up and inserted into the collar stand. Literally trace both the left and right hand sides this way, add your seam allowance, whichever you prefer, and this will allow you to add trim into your collar frill if you so desire. If you don't want trim, you can just cut these out as normal. I have no idea how she managed it, but she found just over 2 meters of this Liberty Fion print in a second-hand shop, so she snapped it up and sent it over to me. It's been in the stash for ages whilst we waited for the perfect pattern to arrive, and having measured the Sézane blouse, comparing it to the Carnation, I was really confident cutting into this fabric without making a wearable muslin. I'm sure there will be a few tweaks that she would like me to make to future iterations, but I was very confident this blouse was going to fit in a way that she liked. So I cut straight into the Liberty. If you've watched any of my videos, you know that I like to do the fiddly bits first. So I'm going to start with the frill. So I have changed this up a little bit from the pattern. I have split the frill into 2 parts. And the reason I've done that is because my friend would like me to copy her Sézane blouse as closely as possible. So she sent me a bunch of these trims. I think I'm going to use, in fact, those 2 look exactly the same. So I think I'm going to use this one. So I need to take it off the board. And I can put that to the side. So I'm going to be sandwiching this trim in between the 2 pieces of the frill. But the first thing that I'll need to do to be able to do that is sew the short frill and the long frill together at the blunt ends. And I'm going to want to make sure when I do this that I am getting the curved ends the right way around. So that one is incorrect because I've got one curve, the curves are opposite to each other, so I need to swap that over. Let's see if we turn it this way if it's a little bit better. So yeah, the right side of the fabric is up, folding that in, and so now you can see that the curves are going the same way, which means that it's going to mirror when I sew these 2 together, they're going to mirror each other. So I am first of all going to sew this short flat edge together. So I'm going to get those sewn together and then press those open, and then we can start inserting the trim. I've sewn my seam together. It was 1 centimeter seam allowance or 3/8 of an inch for the frill pieces. So I've sewn that together and pressed that open. So I can put one of these to the side for now. Now I'm going to need my trim. I purposefully gave myself a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance when I was cutting this pattern piece apart and retracing it so that I could add trim to it. We want the flat end. The curved end is what gets sewn into the front of the shirt. So we want to be putting our trim onto this flat edge. I'm going to just cut off this little bit at the end here because that is got sellotape on it. We don't need that. I am going to be lining up this top flat edge of my trim with my 3/8 of an inch seam allowance so that I am stitching this trim directly onto one of my frills, so that when I sew the two frills together, or the two halves of the frill together, I will get the trim poking out. So I want the edge of the trim that I want to see onto the main body of the fabric, and the straight edge of the trim against the seam allowance, and I'm going to be sewing directly onto that straight edge of the trim to attach it to this piece of the frill. I have my trim attached, so I'm now going to grab my other frill piece, and with the right sides together I am going to match up this straight edge where I have just sewn that trim on, and from the side where I can see the stitching, the previous line of stitching that I've just done, I'm going to pin this together at large intervals, and I'm going to stitch over that line of stitching that I've just done, back stitching at the beginning and the end. You'll notice here that I have actually left myself a little tail of the trim, and on this end I've left all of the trim on there. That's so that when I trim the seam allowance down, I can make sure that the trim is fully encased into the seam allowance or the stitching line that I've just sewn. So I'm just going to pin it roughly the whole way along so that I can then easily stitch this all together along that previous line of stitching. I have my trim sandwiched, so if I open this out, I've got something that looks like this. So I'm going to go and press my seam allowance open with the trim lying to one side, and then I'm going to turn everything and press it flat so that I end up with something that looks like this, and then I can go back to the pattern instructions and actually sew in the gathering stitches to this edge. So there's a lot of extra steps, but that little bit of trim is going to make the blouse look even more like the Sézane one that I'm trying to copy for my friend. Pressing next and then gathering stitches. My frill is now looking like this. The trim is beautifully in place, very happy with it. So the next thing I'm going to do is step 31 from the instructions. I have pinned the raw edges together, and I'm going to run gathering stitches all along this long edge around this curve, because that's what's going to get pulled into the actual seam. The seam allowance with this and the placket is 1 centimeter. I like to do my gathering stitches either side of the stitching line, so I'm going to do one at 1/4 of an inch and one at 1/2 an inch, so that I am both sides of the actual 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter stitching line. I'm going to put my stitch length up as high as it will go and just run those gathering stitches all along that edge, and then this ruffle is done and can be put to the side until I need it. Hopefully you can just about see that there are 2 lines of gathering stitches there. I will just say that this method for gathering running stitches either side of your actual stitching line only works if your fabric recovers from having holes put in it, because this second line is actually in the visible side of the garment, so we are going to have to take that out later. And if you have a really delicate fabric like silk, for example, that probably won't work because it probably will bruise and ruin the fabric. So you want to test this on a scrap piece of fabric before you use this method. But this is a really lovely Liberty cotton lawn and it works really well, so my gathering stitches are now in. I am going to put this to the side and I'm going to start working on the sleeves. I am changing up the sleeves a little bit because the original Chlo blouse has the sleeves be gathered into the cuff, and the Carnation blouse has a different type of cuff that I've not seen before, and the actual sleeve is pleated into it. I think the cuff goes into the underarm seam, which I'm not a big fan of, so I have added in a continuous lap and the appropriate details that you need for a continuous lap. Now I appreciate that I am pointing at something that you really can't see on this piece of fabric, but believe me, there is stay stitching in there around the continuous lap. I do have an entire video about how to add one, draft one and sew one on my channel. I'm going to get that done for both of the sleeves before I then sew up the underarm seam, which I can do with a French seam because I'm not having to put a cuff into it. I've stay stitched the opening on this one. I have cut it open. I've just pinned on the continuous lap piece that I have cut out, and I'm going to get that sewn in. I have my continuous lap in, finished and pressed, so the next thing that I can do now is sew up the underarm seam. We're on to step 58 in the pattern. They are working with a 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. They're not exactly the same, but for purposes of ease of speaking they are, and the pattern would have you sew the seam and then finish your raw edges in the way that you want to, which is totally fine, but I don't personally like overlocking or zigzagging on the inside of my garment, so I'm going to French seam this. So I am putting the underarm seam together with the wrong sides together, and I'm going to sew that at 1/4 of an inch to start my French seam, and I'm going to do the same for both sides. The underarm seams have been French seamed, and that is all my French seam spaghetti. I personally like to press my arm seams to the front, and you can tell it's the front by the single notch. I prefer to press my French seams towards the front because I will press my side seams of my bodice towards the back, and that way I can nest the underarm seams when I come to sew the sleeves on. Now I probably should have put in my e-stitching around the sleeve cap before I sewed those seams, but for some reason I hadn't marked it, so I'm going to do that now. And that also means that I will have my machine set up for gathering stitches, so I can put those in around the cuff as well. So I'm going to get that done. Again, I like to run my e-stitching and my gathering stitching either side of my stitching line. I'll do these ones at a 3/8 of an inch and then 3/4 of an inch, so that it's either side of the actual stitching line. I just find that it gives me the nicest gathers. Like I say, you can only do that if your fabric recovers from being sewn through, because one line of stitching will be visible on the actual garment that way. E-stitching in the cap and then gathering stitching around the cuff. Just triple checked, and the cuffs are sewn with the smaller seam allowance, so I'm going to be doing my gathering stitching around the bottom of my sleeve at a 1/4 of an inch and just over 1/2 an inch, so that the 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimetre seam allowance is in the middle. I'm very glad I checked that before I did it. Okay, I've got all my gathering stitches in my sleeve, so the next things I want to work on are my cuffs. Now I have already put the interfacing on and trimmed off all the excess from around the edges, because as much as I try, I never get them exactly the same size. The interfacing seems to always just be a little bit bigger, and I don't like having the excess floating around because it sticks to the iron, so I just trim it off. That's my preference. So I have gone over to the ironing board and I've pressed these in half, wrong sides together. Now I need to press under the seam allowance that's going to be on the inside of the cuff. The seam allowance for these is 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimetre, and again, I know that they're not exactly the same measurement, but it's, you know, the sort of like standard measurements to talk about. So the way that I like to get that completely accurate is I'll draw on a line, which I hope you can just see here. I've done that in friction pen, which does come away with heat, so you do need to be careful about that, obviously, because I'm going to go and pressing this, so the line will disappear as I press it. Also, you want to make sure that your friction pen does actually disappear and not leave a white residue on your project, so test it on a scrap of fabric before you start drawing on your actual fabric. But I have drawn my friction pen line double the seam allowance, so 3/4 of an inch away, which means that when I go over to the ironing board, I can fold the raw edge of my seam allowance up to that line, and it will be 3/8 of an inch exactly. And it's just the way that I like to get my seam allowance nice and crisp without eyeballing it. 5/8 of an inch I usually eyeball because I'm pretty good at that by now, but this is one that I don't work with all that often, so I have drawn it in a line. So I'm going to go get those pressed, and then I can sew the edges, the side edges of these cuffs together. My cuffs are sewn and I have trimmed off the excess so that I can get nice pointy corners. So I'm going to turn them through, and with my purple fang or your pokey device of choice, just work the corners so that they are nice and flat, and then I can take this over to the ironing board to just press those seams that I've just sewn so that they are nice and flat. And then once that's done, we can attach these to the sleeves. I have pinned the cuff to the sleeve right sides together. To start with, I actually pinned from the cuff side so I can make sure that I'm not attaching this folded edge here, because I don't want to do that. I want to keep that out of the stitching line. But then I prefer personally to sew gathers with the gather under the presser foot and the flat edge under the feed dogs, or on the feed dogs, just because that way I feel I have more control over how the gathers actually get sewn into place. I know not everybody likes to sew things that way around, but it is my preference. I'm making sure that I've got the piece of my continuous lap folded under that needs to be, so that's the front edge. I've attached that to the side of the cuff, and I'm now going to sew this at 3/8 of an inch the whole way around, just making sure that they sew in nicely to the cuff. I have finished off the cuff. I hand sewed or slip stitched the inner cuff to the sleeve just to finish that off, because I don't want any visible top stitching on the exterior of the cuff. So sleeves are now done. Now I'm moving on to the body of the shirt. So I have just sewn in the darts. I'm going to put in the stay stitching, which is step number 1, I believe, to the back neckline on the yoke and also the neckline on the front pieces. Then I can get all of those attached to each other. I will be burritoing the yoke. I have added in the small amount of gathering to the top back here. It's between the 2 notches. So I'm going to pin on my first yoke piece. When there's a gathering sections like this, I like to pin in the 2 flat edges first. And as I mentioned earlier, I also prefer to sew with the gathering under the presser foot, so gathering up as it were. So that's why I just turned the work over, so that I've now got the lower back piece on top and the yoke underneath. So I'm going to get this all pinned into place, get the gathers pulled and put into place as well so that they are nicely distributed. And then I'm also going to add the next yoke on, and I'm going to do that right side to wrong side on the interior so that I can start sewing in the yoke and sandwich everything into place. And if you can hear the pitter patter of teeny tiny feet, there's a little blonde puppy who is trying to help. I haven't marked, I know I've marked the centre of the top of the yoke, but I haven't marked the centre of the bottom of the yoke, so I'm just going to put a teeny tiny little clip in there so that I can match that up with the centre of the lower shirt, and that way I can make sure that I have an even amount of gathers either side of the exact centre back. This fabric is quite nice because it's the gathers are staying in nicely because it's kind of sticky cotton as it were. Some fabrics don't enjoy gathering and can be a little bit problematic to get pretty gathers, but this one's behaving quite nicely. I'm going to do the other side. Got the fabrics right sides together at the moment for the outer yoke. Just gonna even those out. So now I'm going to grab my other yoke, and with the right side of the yoke to the wrong side of the lower shirt, I'm just going to pin that into place so that I am sandwiching the lower part of the shirt, and then I can sew that all at 5/8 of an inch in one go. You don't have to do it this way, you can do it in individual passes, but this is just my preference, and especially for something as well behaved as this Liberty cotton lawn. If it was a slipperier fabric, then I probably would sew that first line of stitching so that I could finesse the gathers as I went and make sure that everything was behaving itself. But like I say, this cotton lawn is nice and crispy and doing, you know, I'm putting it into a position and it's staying there, so I don't need to worry too much about things getting out of whack. And I've got a puppy that I'm ignoring. Most of the projects in this house are made with additional fur, be it cat or puppy. So happy with that. I'm going to sew that at 5/8 of an inch from side to side and then go and press everything open. I have pressed the yoke and I have also pressed the darts that I've sewn, and I have now, with right sides together, pinned the front shoulder seams together with the back yoke, and I've left the internal yoke flying free so that I can burrito things later. I'm going to sew both of these at 5/8 of an inch, and then I will wrap everything up to burrito the shoulder seams for a clean finish on the inside. I have sewn up the shoulder seams, so I'm going to lay everything out nice and flatly, and from the bottom I'm going to start rolling up the fronts and backs until the yoke is revealed. With the in the middle like that, I'm going to bring the inner yoke over and match it up with the shoulder seams, and I personally prefer to sew over the line of stitching that I've just done so I can see exactly where that is. So I've flipped everything over. I'm going to match up the shoulder seams, pin those into place. I'm going to do the same for both sides, and once I'm happy with that, I'm going to go over that line of stitching that I've just done to attach the front to the back, and that will burrito the yoke and give me a nice clean finish on the inside. So I'm going to get this all pinned and sewn, and then I will show you what it looks like when you pull it through. This is a slightly different method to the one mentioned in the pattern. They want you to stitch in the ditch, which is perfectly valid and works really well, but I do prefer how this looks. So I am reaching inside of the yokes, and I'm just going to very gently pull out the main body of the shirt and turn everything out. I have stay stitched my neckline, so I'm not worried about that getting pulled out of shape. Got to get it all the way through. There we go. Okay, so we have a nicely finished yoke and shoulder seam on the outside and the inside. So I'm going to go and give these shoulder seams a press so that they're nice and flat, because they're very bouncy at the moment. And then we can move on to the next step for me, which is going to be putting on the plackets, the collar stand and the frill, because I prefer to do that when the garment is flat rather than when the side seams are sewn up, which again is a deviation from the pattern. I have moved on to step number 20, so I have not sewn up my side seams yet. I need to have one interfaced and one uninterfaced placket. We are going to put those together and sew along one long edge at 3/8 of an inch, and this is going to be the left placket, which is important because the frill does get sandwiched between the right placket, so you do need to keep this in mind when you're putting this together, as it is a asymmetric shirt and you want things to go right. Okay, so 3/8 of an inch. The next step is to crease the seam allowance of the inner placket and press that in. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did earlier, which is to mark the seam allowance in, and we are dealing with 3/8 of an inch, so that means it needs to be 3/4 of an inch, and I'm going to draw a line all along the side here so that I have a guide for pressing and make sure that I'm being nice and accurate. 3/4 of an inch away from the raw edge, so I will go and press under that raw edge to meet that line, so the inner placket is complete. My placket is now fully prepared. I have my bodice pieces here. Now again, the difference is that I haven't sewn up the side seams and I haven't hemmed this, so there will be a few differences for me to bear in mind when I am getting to the bottom edge. I need to be attaching this placket to the left hand side of the bodice as it is worn. Currently I've got the front looking at me, so it's going to be the right hand side as I'm looking at it, the left hand side as it's worn. I need to unfold my placket and I am going to be attaching it from the neck edge down to the hem, and it's the interfaced side that I am attaching to the right side of the bodice fabric. Now these are going to end up being exactly the same length, and I am going to start stitching at the cut edge of the fabric, but at the bottom I am going to mark in the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I am going to stop my stitching there, which will allow me to finish the hem later the way that the pattern wants me to, because if we were following the pattern, as I say, at the moment the hem would be completely finished and the bottom of the placket would be overlapping the bottom edge of the finished hem. But I have not done that because I prefer to do this step with the blouse flat, which means no side seams sewn up. So I'm going to get this pinned into place, and at the moment the bottom edges of both the shirt and the placket meet up perfectly, so I'm going to pin all the way down to the bottom edge, but I am going to, like I say, just mark in the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to start my stitching so that the bottom edge is 3/8 of an inch flapping free, as it were. So just going to get my ruler, 3/8 of an inch from the bottom with everything lined up. That's where I'm going to start my stitching. So I'm going to back stitch there and stitch all the way up to the top at 3/8 of an inch. I've left the bottom edge free by 3/8 of an inch, but I've stitched all the way up to the neckline, and I have finished the stitching at the very top of the neckline. So I'm now going to go and press all of the seam allowance into the placket. Then I'm going to skip the next few steps, which are finishing off the placket and the hem of the placket, because we haven't hemmed the dress shirt. Words are hard. Haven't hemmed the shirt yet. So once I've got this pressed, then we're going to move on to the placket for the other side, which is going to be a different construction method. The left hand placket is as done as it can be for now. We're on to step 27 here. I have marked in the seam allowance at the bottom because, again, I'm doing this out of order from the pattern. I don't want to sew this right to the very bottom of the front edge. I'm going to sew up to the seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch, but I'm going to pin my interfaced Placket piece to my shirt front, and this is the right hand side as you are wearing the blouse, so the left hand side as you are looking at it when it's flat on the table. And again, both of these placket pieces should fit perfectly all the way down to the bottom edge, and they do. So I'm just going to pin this into place, and then I am sewing this at 3/8 of an inch from the neckline down to that 3/8 of an inch seam allowance that I have marked in at the bottom to leave that bottom edge free for hemming later. So this gets sewn at 3/8 of an inch. I have pressed the seam allowance into the placket, or into the placket side of things. So the next step is number 28, and with right sides together, line up bottom of collar stand with interfacing, this one, along the neck edge of the blouse. Match double notches at centre back and collar notches to yoke seams. Line ends of collar to the ends of the placket. The collar end at the right side will match the placket edge. On the left side, the collar will overhang the finished placket edge by 3/8 of an inch. Using lots of pins, carefully join the curved edges, and remember you are matching the stitching line, not the raw edges. So that is always good to remember. So on the left hand side, I'm going to just draw in my seam allowance so that I can match that up correctly. I've got my notches matched in here. I'm just going to fold this in half, make sure that my center is notched, and it is, because when you put interfacing on, sometimes obviously the notches get stuck together. On this side, my placket is still open, which is fine. I will be able to finish this because I'm planning on hand stitching this down later. I don't want to stitch in the ditch. So this side I am going to overlap my collar stand by the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance that I have marked it in there, and just pin that into place. And then I'm going to start matching up my notches. So my first notch matches nicely there, and I have stay stitched this neck edge, so if I need to clip into it I will be able to. So my next notch matches up with my shoulder seam. Then the next notch I have is the centre back, which I have marked on both of my yokes and on my collar stand. Next one will be the next shoulder seam, and then the edge of my placket, and then on this side the edge of the curved collar stand meets up with the very raw edge of the placket. Now I'm going to need to clip into those curves because there is a lot of tension in the neck edge that needs to be released so that these will lie nice and flatly. So I'm going to go around very carefully, clip into my neckline up to but not through my stay stitching, and this will help release the tension to make that everything lie nice and smoothly and get pinned into place smoothly and then sewn into place smoothly. With the yoke, just be careful because there's 2 layers. Okay, now that everything's released, I should be able to pin this into place a little better. So basically I'm going to very carefully work my way around this neckline, pinning everything into place so that everything nice and smoothly, so that we can sew our collar stand into place with no tucks or puckers. This will take a while, so just ease everything into place, clip where you need to, clip more if you need to, and we will get there. That was definitely not the most fun I've ever had doing a neckline, and I can definitely clip into this further because my stay stitching is a good, it's not a 1/4 of an inch, but it's over 1/8 of an inch away from the actual line of stitching, and there is a lot of tension in there that I need to release. I sewed this with the collar stand down, as you saw, and the shirt up because this is the area that was going to get puckered, and thankfully there are no puckers in there. So I'm going to go through and I'm just going to extend my clips through my stay stitching now, just to release a little bit more of that tension so that this neckline sits a little bit flatter, because at the moment it's very puckered, and it would have been slightly easier to do this if I'd gotten my stay stitching a little closer to the stitching line. But that's okay. I'd rather err on the side of I have to do more later than I've done too much, because obviously when you do too much you can't usually take it back. That's already sitting a lot better. This is the time that you want to make sure that your scissors are sharp right up to the point. Mine aren't. They have dulled over time, which obviously happens, and so I probably want to get myself a new pair of snips just to make this process a little easier. There we go. That's sitting a lot flatter and nicer. So the next step is to press all of the seam allowance up into the collar, and then we can start working on the frill. As you saw earlier, I've already made my frill, so I have matched up my notch on my frill to the notch on the collar stand. I've matched up the next notch to the center back. There is another notch, and the seam for the frill is kind of in the middle of this particular loop. So the next notch matches up with the other notch on the other end of the collar stand, and then there is a final notch down here on the placket where the frill ends. So I've got to gather all of this frill into this bit, and then all of this frill into the collar stand. So I'm going to start by pulling on my gathering threads and getting this longer piece attached to the placket, and I want to be making sure that my gathers are as evenly distributed as possible, and I'm going to be going around the edge, that collar stand, that curve of the collar stand there, so I'm going to be really careful in that area to make sure that there's no tucks or puckers get put in. So basically I am just attaching the frill to the placket and the collar stand, matching up the notches, and then distributing the gathers before I can sew it in. Wish me luck. That took quite a long time, but I have got all of my gathers evenly distributed. I am now going to sew these into place at 3/8 of an inch the whole way around. I'm doing it at 3/8 of an inch, which is the stitching line, because I want to make sure that these are exactly where I want them. I will be able to sew over that stitching line later when I am putting on the other placket and collar stand to finish this raw edge off. So I'm going to start down here on this edge and sew at 3/8 of an inch all the way around to secure the frill into place. I have my ruffle attached, so I'm going to put that to the side for now, because I need my leftover collar stand and my leftover placket. We're on to step 35 now. I need to press under the seam allowance of both of these. So I'm going to do the bottom edge of the collar stand and then one edge of the placket. If you have a directional fabric, that edge will matter, but this, whilst I think it might be directional, I haven't cut it out as directional, so I'm kind of just going with it. So I'm going to do the same thing that I've done for the last few where I want to turn the seam allowance up. I'm going to mark 3/4 of an inch away from the raw edge so that I can turn up the exact 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to do the same for the collar stand and the placket, and then go and get those pressed. We are on to step 36. So I am laying my pattern pieces out so that they look the exact same as the picture. I have got the right side of the collar stand facing upwards, and I've got the wrong side of the placket facing inwards, and the seam allowance is here and the seam allowance that I've pressed under is here. By the looks of the picture, I'm actually keeping the seam allowance of the placket turned under. It's just the seam allowance of the collar stand that I'm unfurling. So I'm going to sew that at 3/8 of an inch, and then theoretically this should fit perfectly to this blouse that we've just sewn. This should now fit right sides together over the ruffle with the existing collar stand and placket, and it does. Right sides together will sandwich the ruffle. So I'm going to match up my notches, and I am going to be sewing this from the other side, which is where my previous line of stitching will show, just so that I can make sure that I am sewing over that line of stitching that attaches the ruffle to make sure that I'm maintaining my 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I have a feeling they're going to recommend clipping a lot of this bulk out of this seam allowance, because we've got to put some buttonholes in here, so yeah. Let's fingers crossed make sure that that happens. But basically that's what you want to end up with, is when the right sides are together, that the remaining placket pieces fit together. If you end up with anything else, you need to unpick your collar stand and placket and sew it to the other side, because basically you need a mirror of what you've already got. Words are hard, I know what I mean. So I'm going to sew this. Again, I'm going to start 3/8 of an inch away from the bottom edge, and I'm going to go all the way around to the end of my collar placket the other side here. I'm going to get it all pinned into place and sewn. Then we can look at taking out some of the bulk of all of those gathers. Wish me luck. I've sewn my collar stand and placket to the shirt. So the pattern would like us to layer the seam allowance, which by that they mean trim the outer interfaced collar edge and clip into the curves. I can understand why we're doing this because there are an awful lot of layers in here. So I'm going to go around and trim off the interfaced like they've asked for, so I'm trimming that down by 1/4 of an inch so that there's an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance left. If you have applique scissors, they would be a really good thing to use at this time. And then I'm going to clip into the curves of the collar stand so that hopefully it will all turn through quite nicely. When I press this as well, that will help this seam to lie a little flatter because I haven't pressed any of the frill as yet, so it's still very poofy. Okay, so that is all clipped, so now we can turn this around, which I believe is the next step. Yeah, so we've got to turn this all around. To go and press everything nice and flatly. Then I can take out the gathering stitches from my frill. Then we need to finish off the inside seam, which I am going to do by slip stitching this into place. The pattern does ask you to stitch in the ditch, which is definitely a viable option, but because of the way we've pressed the seam allowances, there won't be an overlap, so I always find it a little bit of a nightmare to get that to look even and nice slip stitching in the ditch without pre-slip stitching the placket edge close, which I think I'm going to do by hand and then just leave it done by hand. So yeah, I'm going to go and give this a press so that everything lies nice and flatly. I've sewn down the collar stand on the interior, but I haven't done the plackets as yet. I'm going to sew the side seams together and then hem it and then do the plackets so that I can finish the bottom edge cleanly. I'm going to sew the side seams with French seams, which means I am going to pin these together with the wrong sides together and sew my first seam at 1/4 of an inch, then trim, press and sew again at 3/8 of an inch to enclose all the raw edges. And I'm going to do the same for both sides. It's a new day. The side seams have been finished and pressed towards the back, so I am now going to press and finish the hem. It's a 3/8 of an inch hem allowance on the bottom of this shirt, which is kind of tiny, but we do have curves that we're working with, so a smaller hem allowance will make that easier. I am tackling this the same way that I've been doing all of the pressing for hems. I've drawn a line 3/4 of an inch away from the cut edge. I'm going to fold that over and press my raw edge up to that line to get myself a nice crease. Then I'm going to fold that raw edge in again so that the raw edge of that is enclosed. Literally gone the whole way around and drawn in the pressing line. As you will remember from earlier, I didn't sew the bottom of the plackets up. I've left those open by 3/8 of an inch so that I will be able to turn this seam allowance up and finish it before I then move on to finishing the plackets. Definitely not the most fun I've ever had at the iron, but this is now fully pressed, so I can go around and sew this into place so that the shirt is fully hemmed. Then I can complete the plackets. Hopefully that's in focus, but we have the hem finished and we've still got the plackets open at the bottom. So what we need to do now is open up the plackets and you're going to fold them back on themselves so that the raw edges meet, and then you want to sew across the bottom at 3/8 of an inch to enclose that raw edge so that when we turn it out, the bottom of the placket will be finished. You want this to be really nice and precise. So you basically just fold your placket back on itself and then stitch at the seam allowance, and you do want to stitch the pressed under seams in place. So I'm going to get that done for both sides. I have sewn the placket end together and I'm going to see if I can turn this through without clipping, but I might need to clip to get my corner nice and pointy, but we will see. Without clipping, that has worked quite nicely. So that's what the finished end of the placket looks like when the shirt is hemmed and the placket is done. I am going to slip stitch the placket closed rather than stitch in the ditch. Another option, which I might do for my next one of these, is actually just to top stitch or edge stitch all the way around the placket and the collar stand. I think even if I did that though, I would still probably slip stitch the placket into place, because you'll have more control rather than just pinning it into place, even if you are going to edge stitch it. But I think for this one, no visible top stitching, except for obviously the hem. Okay, something else I wanted to show you really quickly, because I get this comment quite a lot on different videos where you're tucking things in like this. At the moment, we've got the seam allowance of the placket kind of sitting just here. Placket seam allowance is there. When you're slip stitching it, you can kind of tuck that out of the way and slip stitch it into place so that it doesn't show. When you are edge stitching, for example, you might not be able to get that to sit quite so neatly. So what I like to do is flip out the shirt seam allowance. So you can see here, this bit has been pressed under from where I hemmed the shirt earlier. You want to flip that out and you want to tuck that over the placket seam allowance so that it is sitting on top of that seam allowance. And you can do this on collar stands as well. You're still going to have the same layers of bulk, but it's just going to sit that little bit flatter, and you won't have any of the folded raw edges of the placket sticking out of the side there. So now that I have folded that over, I'm going to pin everything into place, like I say, and then slip stitch the placket all the way along both sides. I have got both plackets completely finished and I've given everything a press. So the next thing I'm going to do is attach my sleeves, and I want to do this with French seams. I do have a full tutorial on how to attach French seams in a sleeve. I would imagine it would work for most circular openings, but the first thing I need to do is turn my sleeves inside out so that I can match up wrong side to wrong side. And that's the front, so that one's going to go to that one. So basically it's exactly the same way that you would do any French. Wrong sides together, sew at 1/4 of an inch, trim, press, sew at 3/8 of an inch. You can even do it the other way around with a sleeve and do 3/8 of an inch first, trim, press, and do 1/4 of an inch last, so that you end up with a narrower seam at the sleeve opening. That can be good because it just gives more mobility to the round seam that does take, you know, is going to be moved a lot when it's worn. So whichever way you prefer. This is not like the most super fitted thing, so I'm going to just do the 1/4 of an inch first, then 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to get both my sleeves set in, and then it will be time for buttonholes. The final thing that I needed to do was get the measurement for the buttonholes that Tatty would like for her final blouse, and once I had those, I put my buttonholes and buttons in and the project was finished. Now, the interim of asking for the measurements and getting the measurements was about a week, which left me with enough time to cut out and sew up another carnation blouse. This time I did it out of a Lady McElroy cotton lawn. It's called Foxy Woodlands, and this is the leftovers that I had from the 5-meter cut that was given to me as a birthday present, and I have made a dress out of this, which I absolutely love. Tatty had bought me a bunch of different trims to try, and there were some beige versions as well as the ivory. My brain put the Foxy Woodland and creamier trim together, and this is the end result. I absolutely love this as an object. I think it is beautiful. It is not for me. So Tatty is getting 2 blouses. I sent her a photo and she's like, oh, it's like a frilly hedgerow. So I'm sending her both of them. And I'm really pleased because that ticks off 2 of the 7 or 8 Christmas birthday presents that I owe her. I really enjoyed putting this blouse together. I think the instructions are well written. Something that did happen when I was printing out the instructions is that my black ink cartridge was failing, and I hadn't realized this. So my actual pattern instructions have the black fabric that they are making their photographed pattern up in red, which I actually find a little bit easier to decode than the black and white spot that they use for the photographs. I think that maybe a different choice of fabric would have helped, but the written instructions were good enough that I could decipher what they were asking me to do. As you saw, I changed the order of operations so that I could put in the neckband, the plackets and the frill whilst the blouse was flat rather than having the side seams sewn up. I do think that was an easier way of doing it, and I don't think the way that I finished off the placket ends and the hem was any more difficult than the way that the pattern instructs. So personally, I will always do it that way because I find it much easier to do that kind of fiddly work when things are flat rather than when things have got more of a 3D shape, if that makes sense. I do think this is an absolutely gorgeous pattern. I don't think I will ever make one for myself because I do prefer a much more fitted bodice and voluminous bottom. I've tried it on. I'm not going to show it to you guys because I just really don't like how it looks on me. The only time you're going to see it is on these mannequins. You probably won't be seeing these on my best friend once I've sent them to her because she is not a fan of having her photo taken. So like I say, the only time you're really going to see these two shirts is on the mannequin. So I made an effort to make the photos look nice. I can see myself making this blouse for me if I did it in something very, very fluid and drapey, like a viscose, possibly even a silk. I don't think I will go in with a silk to test that theory. I think I will try a viscose first, but I do think that for me, my preference is a much more fitted shirt, like the Vogue 9345 tie front shirt or the kind of like hack that I did to make it into a tuckable in blouse. That's much more my kind of speed than this shirt, but I do think it is an absolutely gorgeous pattern if it's the kind of thing that you would like to wear like my best friend would. You'll have to let me know in the comments down below if you've made the carnation yourself. Let me know what fabrics you've made it in because I would love to hear from anyone who's made it in something a little bit drapier and has the usual same preference as me for a tighter, more fitted bodice shirt style. Let me know how your drapey versions have turned out. I hope this video was somewhat helpful if you want to tweak your carnation to look more like a Chlo. I'm going to be really interested to hear what Tatty thinks of her finished garments. She has approved of them via photos, but she hasn't received them yet, so I promise I will put a little update in the description to let you know how she gets on with them. But like I say, I don't think you're going to get to see worn photos. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one here.